What if the version of the resurrection story the entire Western world has been taught for 2,000 years is missing its most important part? Mel Gibson spent years researching what the Ethiopian Bible says about what happened after the crucifixion. What he found forced him to rewrite the entire script. Mel Gibson has been working on the sequel to The Passion of the Christ for years, and the people who have followed that project closely already know this is not just a continuation, because somewhere during that process, something changed, which forced him to stop and rethink the entire direction of the film.
There's a lot required because it is, I'll just tell you this, it's an acid trip when we wrote it. It is like, I've never read anything like it. And my brother and I and Randall all sort of congregated on this, so there's some good heads.
That change did not come from a new interpretation of the same material. It came from looking at material most people have never seen. Because when Gibson began researching the resurrection, he did not stop at the Western canon. He went further, into a different biblical tradition entirely, one that developed outside the systems that shaped the version most people know, preserved in a separate line of transmission for centuries. That matters because the version most people are familiar with feels complete. The crucifixion, the resurrection, a few appearances, and then the story comes to a close. It is structured to end there. The focus stays on the event itself, on what happened in that moment, and everything that follows feels like a closing sequence. But in the Ethiopian tradition, that same sequence does not close the story. It opens it. What follows is not treated as a brief transition, but as the most important part of the entire narrative. The part where everything is explained. Ned, not implied. The part where the meaning of what just happened is made clear, not left to interpretation.
But then I got really good at it. And I think, especially with something like The Passion that I did, the written word was very important. Because it was, you got all those books, the Bible, you've got the different Gospels and stuff that people are quite familiar with. Half the time, they didn't even need to read the subtitles. They could look at it and know what was going on.
Texts like Enoch, Jubilees, and the Ascension of Isaiah are part of that canon, not as side material, but as part of a continuous system. And alongside them are writings that shift the focus directly onto what happened after the resurrection, not short mentions, not scattered references, extended teachings, structured conversations, and a continuation that assumes the story did not end at the tomb, but moved into something far more deliberate. And that is where the difference becomes difficult to ignore, because in the Western narrative, those 40 days are barely explored. A few appearances, a few final instructions, and then the Ascension. The story moves forward without stopping there, almost as if that period is not the point. But in the Ethiopian text, that same period is slowed down and expanded. It becomes the center, the place where everything is clarified, where the meaning of the resurrection is not suggested, but directly explained, where the focus shifts away from the event itself and toward what it was meant to change.
It's the resurrection story, but it's not linear. Because you can't really, it's hard to understand. So it's got to be put in a framework where you answer a few other questions as well.
That shift is not just about adding detail. It creates a structural problem. Because if the most important teachings come after the resurrection, then the resurrection is not the conclusion of the story. It is the beginning of the part that matters most. And once that possibility is introduced, the version most people know starts to feel different. Not wrong, but incomplete. And that is exactly what Gibson ran into. He was not just looking at new material, he was looking at a version of the story that placed the center somewhere else entirely. Not at the moment of the resurrection, but at what followed it. And that is not something you can simply acknowledge and move past. Because the moment you accept that shift, the entire structure of the film changes with it. What he had been building toward was no longer the final point. It was the beginning of something that had not yet been shown. And that realization forces a choice. Either ignore that material and stay within the familiar structure, or follow it and rebuild the story around it. And he chose to follow it. So the film shifts with it. Not as an addition, not as an extended ending, but as a recentering. Instead of building toward the resurrection as the final moment, the focus moves beyond it. into what was said after, what was taught, and what those teachings were meant to reveal. Because in these texts, the emphasis is no longer on the event alone. It moves inward toward the state of the human heart, toward belief that is not just spoken but lived, and toward a kind of transformation that cannot be reduced to outward form. It stops being about what people saw and becomes about what they were told to become. But it does not stop there. Because these teachings are not framed as optional reflections, they are presented as the core message itself, the part that explains everything that came before. And once that is introduced, the resurrection no longer stands as a single defining moment. It becomes the beginning of a process, something that was meant to continue inside the people who witnessed it, not just be remembered by them. And they do not stay neutral. The teachings include warnings, direct ones, about what happens when the message is repeated without understanding, when people carry the language of belief but lose the meaning behind it, when something essential is slowly replaced by something easier to perform. They describe a future where belief becomes visible but empty, where the structure remains but the transformation it was meant to create disappears. And that tone is very different from a simple retelling. It does not just add depth to the story, it reframes it entirely. Because now the story is not just about what happened, but about what happens after it is misunderstood. And that is where the impact on the film becomes clear. Because once that material becomes central, the story is no longer just about the resurrection, it is about what came after it and what was at stake in those teachings being preserved or lost. And that changes how Gibson tells the story. Because he is no longer building toward a single moment. He is building through it, using it as the point where everything shifts and everything after it begins to unfold, and that creates a completely different kind of film. One that does not end where people expect it to end, but continues into territory that has never been fully explored on screen. And that is why this matters now. Because this is not about adding new scenes to a familiar story, it is about shifting the center of the story itself, moving it away from the moment everyone recognizes and toward the part that has never been explored in detail on screen. Those 40 days have always been there, but they have never been the focus, not like this. And there is one more reason this stands out, because the Ethiopian texts were not just preserved differently, they were protected, copied by hand for centuries in an unchanging form, kept in isolated systems outside the structures that shaped the Western canon. That level of preservation suggests something important. Not just that the texts survived, but they were treated as something that could not be altered without losing their meaning. So when Gibson returns to this story, he is not just revisiting it, he is building it around something that changes where the story leads, not ending at the resurrection, but moving through what came after it, following the part of the story that most people have never seen presented in full. And that is where this film becomes different. Because if that perspective holds, then the story most people know is not wrong, but it is incomplete. And what this film may show is the part of the story that no resurrection film has ever fully shown before.